very much for joining us this morning for COVID-19 impact on solar supply chain. We are very, very lucky to have an excellent panel here this morning, including George Hirschman, President of Swinerton Renewables. We've got Jim Lehman, Founder and CEO of Depcom Power, Thomas Maslin, Associate Director of IHS Markit, Dr. Elizabeth Mayo, Global Director of Solar Services at UL. Please note, all participants, that this webinar will be recorded. It will be available on the K&L Gates Hub website following the presentation this morning. And thank you again for joining us. Going into 2020, there was already considerable pressure on supply chain for solar facilities due to tariffs, uncertainty about consequence of expected 201 guidance, and capital cost pressures in many U.S. power markets. The outbreak of a novel coronavirus, now typically referred to as COVID-19, while production for 2020 ITC safe harbor deliveries was at full bore in China, took the solar industry by surprise. At first, it seemed that the resulting complications for supply chain could be contained and controlled, particularly because many of the initial widespread mitigation efforts largely coincided with the Lunar New Year celebrations in Asia. However, as time has gone by and the virus has leapfrogged around the globe, the impacts on the solar supply chain have become more acute and more widespread. Now, with outbreaks scattered across the United States, there is more potential for disruption to both logistics and construction. Of course, we're all here to talk about the solar supply chain. Issues in the supply chain ripple across the industry. And when we began preparing a couple of weeks ago for the panel at InfoCast Solar Finance that this webinar is stepping in for, we discussed that most industry participants had received at least one force majeure notice, but that not very many developers were seeing direct impacts yet. Panelists, has that changed? Maybe I'll pass that off to George first. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's kind of where we were a couple of weeks ago, in that we'd received notices, but no direct impact. And obviously things have changed. That's why we're doing this remotely. And since then we're seeing less of a direct impact on overseas supply chain, in that we've seen a kind of a ramp back up of a lot of the Asian markets, and seeing the ability to get product to the U.S. shore. The question really now is, how do we get it from U.S. ports, some of which have been closed down recently, to projects, and then have project resources to do it, right? We're in a really changing environment as of literally yesterday. A number of things have changed in our projects. So as folks are either contained at home, with the remote nature of our projects, a number of folks are travelers. Those travelers are experiencing difficulty to get to projects, or the concerns of home life, right, and trying to get back to. So now I think our emphasis has really shifted from, is it the supply chain, or is it the logistics and workforce that are going to be more impactful or more impacted?
Thanks, George. From Depcom's view, just a moment about first from offices side, the California office and our New Jersey office are working from home given their nearness to hotspots. Our Arizona office is working in office. We've added a little bit of distancing there between personnel. Anyone who feels any sickness of any kind works from home until they feel better and they're cleared. For our job sites, again, we watching very closely the government's hotspots. Fortunately, in the 13 sites we have running today, none are adjacent to those. We've seen a nominal amount of absenteeism. We do the facial temperature checks. We've had deep cleanings, just as we've had in our offices. We've done with all of the facilities at our job sites as well. But so far, the craft want to work in their on our direct hire basis and with our subcontractors. Of course, we're distancing there as well. And in doing that, we are consuming some schedule buffer, given the fact that it's is not as efficient to work in that environment as it would be otherwise. And from a product standpoint, to echo what George said, we have so far from product coming in from Turkey and other locations for modules, et cetera. They have cleared ports to date. We have the next ship docks tomorrow, and we checked with port authorities in New Orleans yesterday, and they're still open. So we anticipate that coming off without a hitch. We're, from our supply chain, we're 70% U.S. based, and again, so far we checked with them very routinely and as throughout the week, and making sure that shipments are still on track so far. And again, we're somewhere in early innings of what we understand we're trying to contain here in the U.S. But to date, no missed shipments, and suppliers saying they're still good by us. We have looked at contingency. Some projects have the ability to move out a little bit without affecting the customer's power purchase agreement dates. So we're in contact with them if the opportunity exists where we can shift supply. And not all supply, of course, is interchangeable, but to the degree it is, and we're looking at that contingency. Customers need to understand that and allow us to, put that into our contingency plans to be able to move those around.
And Elizabeth, you see a slightly broader view. Do you have anything to add to that?
I do. From the independent engineering point of view, we are definitely still seeing the force majeure notices coming through. But interestingly, we're actually seeing a bit of pushback from the developers saying that they're not going to accept force majeure until somebody's able to really quantify, why they can't comply. The downtime during, the shutdowns in China coincided with what would have already been reduced production to some extent during the Chinese New Year. There was hope that it would have a limited impact. And as you're hearing from the other panelists, the product is starting to arrive. It's less about getting the product into the U.S. and actually getting it to the product and in the ground. We're also sort of seeing it that it's actually a shift from concern around supply chain and timing to concern around demand for some of the other growth for projects that are a little farther down the road. So I think there's definitely impact that's going to continue to evolve over time.
Thank you. Jim, you mentioned that one of the things that's causing you to eat up some buffer time is just these adaptations to create social distancing protocols and deep cleans and so forth. What are the other biggest causes of the direct impact here? Are we seeing any labor shortages yet? What parts of the supply chain are causing the most pain when there is any pain to be dealt with?
Yeah, so this morning we've got only about 12% absenteeism, and that's not necessarily out of the norm, for flu season. So today we're still moving, craft, either subcontractors or our direct hire groups, as need be to, 2 sites and 2 activities. The buffer side of it is that's what it's there for. We promise our customers, we've do everything we can to avoid disruption to them, via force majeures, and so far we're okay in that respect. We can't predict the future. I think the craft side of it, I said today, that if we have a hot spot site, when it shows up on the government websites, we watch that very closely each morning as they add to. And of course, we're going to shut down. We don't have any choice, safety first. But so far, no hot spots on the labor side. Mm-hmm. And we have people that, as we all know, labor rates are up in the industry, over the last few years as economies have been going strong. So, we pay well even for laborers on site. So they want to work, and they're coming to work. And, of course, we're maintaining that vigilance out there. Consuming buffer has limits, but also with our owners, we know what their power purchase agreement dates are, things of that nature. So we try to work very hard with those who have some buffer on their side as well to understand that if need be, we'll pull product and other things to go to other sites, and we're working with them up front to let them know that our job is to try to manage our full portfolio with all our customers, not at the expense of each other. And so far they understand it. Kind of feels like a little bit different flavor of the nation coming together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think,
George, do you have a different view on that? Go ahead.
No, not a different view, probably very similar view. I mean, we're taking all the same precautions on site and have, adopted a travel policy for our management team, project managers and such that travel to and from jobs, and have limited that to try to maintain a kind of a separation between our rural workforce, where we're seeing much less spread of the virus, and our urban workforce that is, housed in our California offices that are shut down, and locations where we're flying, folks to and from job sites. So we've limited that wherever possible so that we can essentially contain those rural areas where we're seeing far less spread, and, pushing, having individuals kind of interact between those regions. So we are seeing very similar numbers that Jim is talking about as far as absenteeism. We are seeing, we are looking hard at our traveling workforce. We have a large traveling contingent that has been with us for quite a while. Those folks obviously have, concerns away from the project and in homes that are often in or around hotspots. So watching that and figuring out how to manage through that and giving appropriate leave time for those individuals. But at this point, we're seeing the same thing, that we're not seeing impacts that are catastrophic. We are seeing impacts that are likely eating up some project float and other things that we try to manage through a project schedule. But that, I think, as Jim has indicated, we're in the first inning of this, and so literally we're day 2 into what has become a real change in the market. Over the weekend, I think we were all pleasantly surprised with the amount of notifications that came out on the weekend that Monday we had a significant amount of workforce still on site, because you just don't know with the notifications and the spread of information about how people are going to take it coming back to work after a couple of days. So at this point, we're still, we are working closely with our owners, discussing, the issues associated to this on a regular basis. I think the biggest challenges that we have are projects that are due to come online, and working and coordinating commissioning resources, and those things that need to come to the sites and are not specifically on site. So our projects that are in mid-construction have resources that are landed there, working there on a daily basis. When you get into the commissioning phases of projects, you bring in a lot of influx of manufacturing commissioning groups, our commissioning groups, and those folks all have to travel to sites. And those, I think, are things that we are really looking at closely to see how we manage that, because we have, SCADA teams that are based in Oregon that need to get to project sites in West Texas. So that is going to create a new dynamic in how do we get projects commissioned and online during this process.
Yeah, that's definitely a big hurdle. I think, and Elizabeth, you mentioned one thing that some folks are saying is they're basically just going to deny force majeure claims until there's something that's more quantifiable. Obviously, Jim and Georgie both addressed, early on having conversations with your customers and trying to sort things out as far as you can, or as best as you can. What other tools do manufacturers and developers have to address any delays that are ultimately experienced? As you mentioned, George, it's early days, so we don't really know yet, but what are you thinking about and how are you going to get over some of these hurdles?
Well, I think, obviously we're having lots of discussions around force majeure. I think nobody likes it. Nobody likes to deal with it. Owners and developers want to look for any ability to work around. But, as Jim can attest to, being in construction long enough, there are just times where there, in a national emergency like this is unique in that there are unknown consequences that are going to happen from on a day-to-day basis, right? So just denying for the sake of denying, or wishing it away and trying to figure out how to assume that we could, that miracles can happen. Sometimes they just can't. And so I think understanding it and having open dialogue about that is important, so that we all understand that we're not doing it for the sake of doing it, right? And I think we all, we're all in the business to produce and build these projects, right? Construction companies, make money by actually putting product in the ground, right? So it is not in our interest at all to slow down these projects. And so we're all sitting on the same side of the table in this regard. And so having open dialogue and looking downstream, right? We've got to talk to the utilities and other things and really look contractually downstream of where we can push for additional time. That's all that, that's majorities are looking for. Is this a time issue?
And then
Elizabeth here. I want to echo what was just said, in that I think that transparency and communication are going to be one of the most important tools that everyone can bring to the table as we face these. From the independent engineering and the consulting side, we're looking for ways to be creative. As you said, we're all in this together. The end goal is to get the project to market successfully. And, force majeure is something that we don't know. We spend a lot of time right now working with our clients on scenario planning and looking through how do we be prepared in the event of different scenarios coming to play in this constantly evolving landscape. As far as other tools, we're spending time helping to define, how do we, review the supplier's startup quality oversight and risk mitigation plan as these factories are coming back online. You know, if somebody doesn't have something to share in that topic, they're either withholding it or they don't have it. And so in this scenario, that communication is the critical way to be prepared for any of the scenarios, all of which, you know, are kind of on the table, and each day points us a little bit in a new direction of what to expect.
This is Thomas. I also think this is it's due to the fact that it's all this is moving so quickly. We are starting to see more governments trying to react as quickly as possible. Obviously, the case of Taiwan, which just announced a 2-month extension for their feed-in tariff deadline, shifting it from April to June is a good sign. At least I think the point is that the developers and financiers need more clarity. China is also talking about potentially extending or adding an extension for the deadline for projects that were approved in the 2019 bidding round. And then I know India is going through the same sort of situation as well. So I'm sure the United States will sort of discuss with the IRS and things like that, thinking about how there might be ways to smooth things out a little bit.
This is maybe a brief, maybe just 2 brief things that might be helpful for the developer owner community. Is we're on the front end of the projects that are not yet financially closed, or other items that are in the mix to get to closure. We're moving forward under LNTPs, limited notices. We and the customers sharing in that in order to keep the projects moving through the engineering phase, getting the purchase orders done even prior to the financial close, trying to make up some time under kind of what we call a go fast program up front to give more buffer in the schedule once we are underway for this new issue that we're dealing with. And a second, on the back end, as George mentioned, also with the utilities, we had 2 conference calls yesterday with different customers with different utilities that we both described the potential on the back end of the projects where we, in fact, consume the buffer versus penalty, and in both utilities were receptive. It was a very good conversation, very straightforward. Again, it does cost the EPC money when he's on site, sitting out there inefficiently, but also, this is a little bit different time. We all have to bear some pain. So if the utility is going to give us and the owner that relief, but having all 3 of us on the conference call, all 3 kind of seem to be in lockstep, the owner, the EPC, and the utility, that giving us that in 2 cases, 2 months of potential relief. We needed it, showing them that the buffer, had been legitimately consumed due to this.
Yeah, and
I think that.
And I was just going to say, I think the discussion about what what government is going to do through this. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of movement in DC around what a stimulus package looks like, what does it come with, how does it address the industries most impacted. But there will be lots of pieces that are discussed in that, and some of that will be, do we push out some of the safe harbor commitment dates outside of April to maintain those safe harbor projects of equipment and things that couldn't get in place. So, there's a lot of discussions, I think, from the industry standpoint of how do we make up for lost time? Was there, is there ability to look at the ITC differently because of essentially the break in the economic process, right? And this is all about time and step downs and things. So I think all of those are in play. It's not probably the appropriate time yet to really start to do those in a meaningful way until a number of other stimulus-related packages get into place. But there is a lot of discussion around what's the economic impact. How do we get how do we overcome from an economic stimulus process of moving the industry forward once we get through this, and how do we recapture what we had? So a number of those things will likely happen. We saw it happen in 2008, and things that start. Pretty much everything is on the table, I would say, to address some of these impacts, and I think that will likely address some of the tax-related issues around our business, whether that be ITC changes in deadlines for safe harbor projects, or something more substantial to push the market forward as far as tax or grant type of programs that have been used in the past.
Should Congress switch to a grant? Do you think it's going to get so bad that tax credits are just not going to be very valuable anymore in solar?
I think those analysis are being done now, and looking at it, there is a big concern similar to 2008 that the financial industry takes such a impact on this that tax credits are difficult, and that's why the 1603 moved to a grant program or a direct refundable tax credit versus so that we can push projects directly forward. I think that is has been used in the past and likely is on the table as we move forward from this type of crisis.
Yeah, I think sort of we talked about some of the issue of project delays due to constrained supply, things like that. But if there is a lack of project finance, and if the U.S. economy continues to decline, that could be a huge impact for the general renewable space, not just solar, but also wind as well, which is sort of on this constrained timeline. And in the U.S. Market, there's a chance of sort of shortage of tax equity, and really the U.S. solar and wind market relies on this tax equity right in the middle of the phase out of the ITC and PTC. So this is a huge issue, and obviously a lot of developers and others are sort of having communication and conversations with Washington, D.C. thinking about this. For example, there's sort of a pool of potential capital that these companies rely on, but there's sort of a very short list. For example, Bank of America, JP Morgan made up about half of the tax equity for the wind space in 19. And there's cases in which you see a lot of corporations that can be tax equity providers, but as the economy continues to decline, that can dry up. So the case of grants and things like that could be extremely useful.
Mm-hmm. I think, Thomas, thank you for that. And related to that, earlier this year, your company, IHS Markit, released a demand forecast for solar demand and projected a 14% year-over-year increase. Does that prediction hold right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it's still very early. I can start from a high level and then maybe come down to the sort of U.S. level. Overall, the U.S. expects that the virus will sort of have an impact in terms of overall load growth in China, which is one of the largest power markets globally. I think we have about a 30% decline of power demand this year, mostly due to reduced activity in the commercial and industrial sectors. We think that although the existing renewable development is probably going to be less impacted by all this, particularly the wind sector, which is pretty tight in terms of manufacturing capacity. But a lot of developers are going to sort of feel a lot of pressure in terms of capturing the components that they need to build their projects on time, due to the fact that, again, much like the U.S. and other parts of the world, there's sort of specific timelines in which renewables are able to capture feed-in tariffs or the ITC, for example. That said, looking at China, in terms of global installations, we expected about 40 gigawatts of installations this year. About 10 gigawatts are subject to installation deadlines before the end of June. And we sort of are essentially predicting that around 5 to 8 gigawatts of that 10 might experience delays or cancellations. It's a bit early to tell with the U.S. and other regions, but we're essentially assuming that some projects will probably be delayed later in the year, and that as a result, it can have impacts on the economics for projects that are expected to capture the full ITC. That I think the other thing too is we're talking about mostly, I'm assuming, utility scale solar, but also I think there's a chance in which it could have an impact on the residential commercial space, which makes up about 25 to 30% of total solar capacity this year, next year. Primarily due to
I had to piece that together from words heard like gigawatts.
Sorry, if anyone's not talking, could you please mute your phone?
Anyway, my point was essentially that social distancing will probably have an impact in terms of residential and commercial space, due to less of limiting how much interaction you can have through the developer and the homeowner.
Thank you.
So I'll also add to that as the uncertainty continues to grow and the economy is hit, we are seeing as well concern around what that means for the residential and the C&I that isn't, as driven by sort of the tax equity deadlines and hard stops and criteria. So I think there is going to be a bigger impact there in that demand. Also, as we look at China coming back online, there is a chance of a resurgence of the virus throughout China. Should that happen, I think there could be a massive shift and relook at that. The hope is that the quarantine and the steps taken there have had the positive impact and things are on track, and each region will go through their version of that to get things under control. But we are watching to see, is there any uptick now that factories are back? Something like 70 or 80% of the factories are back online. Many of them are still only running at 50 or 60% capacity, but we're going to be watching that because that's a good sign of how do we get a handle on the uncertainty.
Yeah, and another thing related to that, we're already seeing sort of a slight increase in terms of prices of these components. The manufacturing production costs have increased due to sort of shortage and lower utilization rates as well. So it's a combination of several factors that would to behoove, or reduce the interest or demand for both the commercial and residential spaces, because you have sort of higher prices and also inability to communicate or work with the developer and the homeowner or the commercial space as well.
Thank you for that. I think I want to leave a few minutes at the end for questions. Before we get there, we are fairly early in this process still. Obviously, the emergency declaration just came out a few days ago, and very much battening the hatches throughout the country at this point. But, thinking about what's happened so far elsewhere in the world and then what's starting to happen in the United States, do you all have any thoughts about how supply chain management may change in the coming years? Do you expect long-term changes as a consequence of this experience? For example, diversification of the supply chain or different practices in contracting?
It's Jim from DevCom side. One of our initiatives from day one was, Buy American First. It's helping us a lot right now. As I said earlier, about 70% US based. We've seen those disruptions. Again, to George's point earlier, it's early. We may or may not see impacts, from a trucking standpoint, but not so far. So again, we would emphasize that, bring it home and realize we can't get all of that product from here, modules, around the country, but we've had a goal and we maintain it, 0% out of mainland China, good or bad. That's our policy, and so we source the other 30% outside of China and have since day one. In terms of going forward, we encourage and have encouraged the administration to look toward ITC credits more for the upstream industry of the core products on the module side. Everything else we have in the country on steel and cable and motors. But we need that strategically from iPhones, cell phones, laptops to solar panels. Strategically we need those abilities here in the U.S. and we all know those are multi-billion-dollar factories. We think that's the long-term, medium and long-term best thing we could do in terms of our view of lobbying Washington.
Thanks, Jim. George, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that we, with the changes in the supply chain over the years, we've diversified our supply chain dramatically. So we're getting things from, all over the world as well as the U.S. So that has helped during this period of time, and I think we're going to see more movement to domestic manufacturing where possible, which I think will help us all in these situations. I think that we do have some concern right now about our domestic manufacturing facilities and will those be able to maintain through this process, in that we've got a number of them in states where we're seeing significant outbreaks. So that has some concern, but it's it's a short term. I think the long term we're going to be, it is part of all of our goal is to see continued manufacturing in the U.S. and growing that. But I think just having a diverse manufacturing fleet that's really all around the world now and is not focused solely on China, and so that's why we didn't see the impacts that even from the initial China shutdown, because of the diverse manufacturing base. And so I think that is key to this industry, is to have multiple locations where you're receiving product, so that you can deal with these type of issues that really started out regionally and is obviously is a worldwide effect now.
Yeah, and we're also seeing an increased focus on better tracking the quality of the supply chain. Whenever a factory goes offline for an extended period of time, there are a lot of risks that come into play with a new factory or ramping up factories in other regions, et cetera, that can be introduced. Everything from potential shifts in the upstream supply chain in the EVA, the encapsulants, the junction boxes, as well as deviations during the manufacturing, especially when they're trying to run at full bore to get caught back up. So we're seeing a lot of project owners and the financing institutions looking to sort of revive, quality control and oversight. There have been in the industry all sorts of component quality qualification programs that range from production witnessing, ensuring of the bill of materials, all the way through batch testing and performance testing of the various equipment that's being shipped. And, I think previously as an independent engineer, it was always challenging to credit the projects directly into the financial model that we're following these types of best practices. And what we're finding now is that it's very easy to quantify the risk to projects who aren't following them in sort of the wake of the current events. And I think that's making it an increased focus from all parties, from development through financing, to think a little more about what are the qualification programs they have for each of their suppliers.
Thank you for expressing your views. I think that this has been a really interesting panel, and we're very grateful for your thoughts. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we can open it up for questions from the audience. Folks who have dialed in on the phone, you can unmute yourself by hitting *6. And anyone who's logged in through WebEx, you can just click on the microphone on the screen in order to unmute yourself. We've only got time for a couple of questions, so please introduce yourself when you start speaking, and then pose your question for the panelists. And if there
Can
are
you hear me?
questions, yes.
Hi, this is Jay Miles with RPCS, and this has been a really valuable webinar. Can we schedule these once a week and just keep each other in the loop of what we're hearing and what we're doing? And this is obviously an evolving crisis, and next week's going to be very different.
Sure. I think there's a lot of demand for it. I'm seeing a lot of these webinars proliferate. At K&L Gates, we are planning on scheduling an update on wind. Hopefully next week. We're still pulling it together. There are other options. SIA, for example, is having a webinar later on this week. We can have a conversation with the panelists separately just to see if they have time to do it on a recurring basis. But
sorry, this is Thomas Mezen. I just I rejoined. I lost connection.
oh, sure.
Hi, Elizabeth Mayo with UL Renewables. No, we find that we're actually on the phone a lot, discussing this regularly with all of our clients. So we encourage anyone that has questions to reach out. We're happy to have regular discussions. It's important for us to hear what folks are concerned about, as well as to give guidance on what we're seeing. And as I said earlier, I think it's all about communication and transparency, and all of us working together. That's going to kind of get us through this and keep things as much on track as possible. So, I don't know that I can schedule a regular webinar, but I'm happy to have anyone reach out.
Yeah, this is George. This is George. I'm, I get to wear two hats these days as running my day job at Swinnerton, but also as the board chair of SEIA, and can say that we are working hard to at SEIA to get information out to the industry as these things unfold, and provide as much information as possible. So I'm available. SEIA is available for the industry to provide information and be really a portal to what we're seeing in the industry. So I don't know that I can commit to it once a week. We have a lot of things going, but I will be as available as I possibly can to at least give my views and our views of what we're seeing and doing as this unfolds.
Absolutely. And of course, at P&L, we're fielding questions from across industries, across the world, all the time on this, and have quite a few programs available on our hub page. We've had a webinar yesterday on the executive proclamation declaring a national emergency, and have several others coming up. And with that, we're just a minute over time. I just want to say thank you again to the panelists, George Hirschman, President of Swinnerton Renewable Energy and SOLVE, also SVP up at the parent company, Elizabeth Mayo, who is Solicitor at UL, Similarly, founder Power and Associate Director at IHS Markets. We're very lucky to have you all this morning. Thank you so much for sharing your views, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Thank you all for attending. Bye.
Great, thank you.